And then it happened, Book 7, Chapter 10, Mr. Butterworth's Bad Day. It was August, and Gordon, Paul, and I had just spent the entire afternoon at Paula's house playing in the barn. We worked for hours arranging bales of hay into a series of tunnels, hidden rooms, and a lookout. It was the best hay fort we'd ever made, and we had worked up quite an appetite. We headed into the kitchen of the farmhouse looking for a quick snack. It was close to dinner time, and knowing how every mother feels about kids ruining their appetite, we snuck in quietly and lifted the lid off of the cookie jar. We each grabbed a handful of the huge homemade cookies, and we were just tiptoeing out of the kitchen when Paula's mother burst through the door. "There you are," she blurted out, completely ignoring the cookies in her hands. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Have you heard the news?" "No," we said in unison. "We've been in the barn all afternoon," added Paulo. We had learned long ago that there were two types of news. Good news, where nobody gets into trouble, and bad news, where somebody always gets into trouble, usually Gordon, Paulo, and me. We all stared at Mrs. Lima, trying to determine which type of news this was. To my surprise, she rushed up to me and put her hand on my shoulder. "Your mother phoned a few minutes ago. It seems that an ambulance has taken your neighbour to the hospital. I know how fond you are of Mr. Butterworth." I was too shocked to speak. Poor Mr. Butterworth, I thought. "He was out cutting his grass and fell and hit his head," she continued. "He was knocked unconscious." Is he going to be okay?" asked Paulo. "It's too soon to tell," said his mother, "but he's not a young man." She didn't need to finish her sentence. The three of us sat down on a kitchen table to eat our cookies, but our appetites seemed to have suddenly vanished. "He'll be okay," said Paulo, trying to cheer me up. "He's a tough old guy." "I think we should visit him in the hospital tomorrow, if they'll let him have visitors," said Gordon. "After all, he's been pretty good to us." "That's a great idea," I said. Mr. Butterworth had been good to the three of us, and we were all quite concerned for him. The next morning, Paulo and Gordon arrived at my house wearing their best clothes. Like me, their shoes were polished, their hair was combed, and they were freshly showered. Gordon even wore a tie. We wanted to look our very best for the visit, and we all clutched get-well cards in our hands. My mother drove us all to the small hospital in town and dropped us off at the door marked Visitor's Entrance. "I'll pick you up in half an hour," she told us. Inside the hospital, Gordon, Paul, and I hurried to the front desk and asked where Mr. Butterworth's room was. A hospital volunteer in a striped jumper told us he was on the third floor in room 317. When the elevator door finally opened on the third floor, we made our way to the nurse's station to ask whether Mr. Butterworth could have visitors. The station was deserted. We looked down the long hall leading to the patient's rooms. It too was deserted. So we decided to go straight to room 317 and quietly peek inside. The door was slightly ajar. When we found Mr. Butterworth's room, we peeked inside. Mr. Butterworth was laying in bed and the light was off. I gently knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, I quietly called his name. Again, there was no response. So Gordon, Paul, and I tiptoed into his room to leave our get-well cards on his bedside table, where he would find them when he awoke. Poor Mr. Butterworth lay motionless in the hospital bed, his head wrapped in a large bandage, monitors humming beside him, and tubes coming out of his nose and mouth. We crossed the room and stood beside his bed, looking down at the sleeping old man. And then it happened. Suddenly, Mr. Butterworth's eyes flew open and he made a horrible gasping sound as he struggled to breathe. He sat up in bed, waving his arms around frantically. Thank goodness we had arrived when we did. Paul and I were too stunned to move, but Gordon leapt into action. "I'll get the nurse," he shouted, running out of the room. As he did, Mr. Butterworth managed to get a breath of air, and he seemed to relax a little bit. He fell back on the pillows, gasping heavily. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead and were soaking into his bandage. Seconds later, Gordon raced back into the room and ran up beside the bed. "I can't find anyone," he shouted. I opened my mouth to tell Gordon that Mr. Butterworth seemed to be doing better, when suddenly the old man gasped and began struggling for air again. His arms thrashed wildly around, and he seemed to be pointing to something on his bedside table. Heroically, Gordon ran out of the room again, determined to find a nurse or doctor to help our poor friend. As Paul and I stood by helplessly, Mr. Butterworth breathed deeply and seemed able to get a few breaths of air into his lungs. "It's no use. This place is deserted," cried Gordon, bursting back into the room and leaning over Mr. Butterworth. "How's he doing?" Once again, Mr. Butterworth began struggling for air. He tried speaking, but all that came out was an incoherent gurgling sound. He pointed frantically to the bedside table again, and all that was on it was a pad of hospital paper and a pen. Paulo picked them up and handed them to Mr. Butterworth, who tore them out of his hands and quickly scribbled something on it. At the same time, I noticed an emergency call bell above his bed and pressed it. Pressed it desperately. Mr. Butterworth finished what he was writing, tore off the top page and thrust it at Gordon. As he collapsed on his pillow, unmoving, a team of doctors and nurses rushed into the room and shoved us aside. They immediately began working on Mr. Butterworth, trying to revive him. Outside in the hallway, Gordon, Paul, and I waited, teary-eyed for the news. Please let him be okay, I thought. After what seemed like hours, a doctor finally came out. He took us aside, and to our great relief, he told us that Mr. Butterworth was going to be fine. He was exhausted from his ordeal and needed to rest, so we were to go home. As we rode down the elevator, I remembered Mr. Butterworth's note. "Hey, Gordon," I said, "what was on that note that Mr. Butterworth gave you?" "I forgot about that," exclaimed Gordon. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the note and read it aloud, the colour draining from his face as he did so. The note read, "Gordon, you are standing on my oxygen tube." End of Book 7.